The Faxination Universal Output Connector, or UOC for short, allows for the sending of outbound fax and mobile messages via a virtual printer. Although end users can send messages via this connector, it's most commonly used by automated processes and non-Windows applications. For PCL and PostScript printers, you must use the printer drivers that are specified in the Faxination documentation. Plain ASCII text printers are also supported. The connector has special support for bulk faxing based on mail merging in databases. And there is no physical printer required. You only need to install the printer driver, share the printer on the network, and set it to paused. The Faxination Universal Output Connector will monitor the printer's spool folder for new outbound jobs. The workflow of the Universal Output Connector. First, the user or application generates a document that includes scan strings for the Faxination message options. The user or application prints the document to the shared network printer that is being monitored by the Universal Output Connector. The UOC checks the spool folder for new messages. When a new message is received, the UOC extracts the scan strings from the spooled printer data to determine the message type, the destination, and the cover sheet to use, etc. The UOC passes the message to the Faxination kernel for processing. If notifications are enabled, the sending user or application is determined from the spooled data, scan strings, or the configuration in the UOC Addresses tab. Note that if you require notifications, you must have an inbound capable Faxination host that can deliver the notification. The UOC by itself is outbound only. The UOC requires scan strings to be embedded in the document to convey information to the Faxination kernel. At absolute minimum, the destination fax or mobile number must be supplied as a scan string. Scan strings can also be used to set the cover sheet for outbound fax messages, set the charge code, CSID, message priority, etc. The scan strings are removed from the document before it is transmitted. Mail merge uses a document with variables that are populated by a database, with each row of the database generating a unique document, or in our case, a unique fax message. There are two special scan strings dedicated to mail merge. @mergex, where x is the length in pages of each copy of the merged document, and @docbreak, which is used for documents that do not have a fixed length. The merge feature is described in detail in the Faxination 2016 Host Connectors Guide. The UOC supports 3 different printer driver output types. Generic text is used with plain ASCII text and uses fixed width fonts with no graphic capabilities. PCL is a common printer language which requires a specific printer driver and a licensed PCL converter within Faxination. And PostScript, which also requires a specific printer driver but has multiple converters available, including GhostScript. Although the limitations of plain ASCII printing are clear, there's really no difference between PCL and PostScript in terms of performance or quality. To configure a printer for use with the UOC, begin by installing a printer driver. Select the generic text printer that comes with every Windows Server operating system for plain ASCII text printing. For PostScript, install the generic MS Publisher Image Setter for PostScript, which is also included with Windows. For PCL, Fenestre recommends the Canon IR400 PCL 5E driver, which can be downloaded from the Canon website. You can find the download link in the Faxination 2016 Host Connectors Guide. Share the printer on the network and set it to paused. In the properties of the printer, turn off advanced printing features. The printer should be installed on a server in your environment other than the Faxination server. And ensure that the Faxination service account has unrestricted access rights to the spool folder where the printer is installed and full control of the printer itself. On the Jobs tab, you can configure the interval between checks of the spool folder for new jobs. The default is 20 seconds. And you can configure the notification options that are common to all outbound capable Faxination host connectors. On the Directories tab, you can configure the path used for temporary file storage when messages are passed between this connector and the Faxination kernel. On the Data Sources tab, you can configure the data source where UOC users are stored and any access credentials that are required for that data source. This will be the FEN messaging database in SQL by default. The Scan Strings tab displays an editable list of the scan strings that are supported by the UOC. You may want to modify these scan strings in cases where Faxination has replaced a competing fax solution with a similar host connector. The Printers tab is where all of the monitored printers are configured. The Addresses tab allows you to configure the address mappings that are used for UOC notifications. The Network ID is the identifier of the sending user that is pulled from the spooled printer data. The QID is NT for all Windows-based operating systems. You may define a friendly name or map the network ID to the friendly name. You can select the host connector that will deliver the inbound notifications, the address type, and the address that matches the address type, or a VB script to run against the spooled data that will return the sender information to the UOC. The most common support issue that we have with the Universal Output Connector is no scan strings found. As we mentioned earlier, at least one scan string must be present in the spooled data for Faxination to be able to successfully process the message. If no scan strings can be found, the message fails. All scan strings must appear at the beginning of the document, or at least within the first 500 lines. The scan string should use a font that is native to the printer language that you're using. Custom and non-standard fonts are printed as vector images instead of text, and won't appear in the spooled data as text that can be parsed by Faxination. If you've customized your scan strings or changed the @ symbol identifier, note that the scan strings must still end with the /@ symbol. Now we'll look at the Faxination SAP connector. It supports inbound and outbound fax and mobile messaging from SAP Office. Both .NET and RFC communication are supported, but RFC is the most common. The connector has been completely updated for the Faxination 2016 release using the latest 64-bit SDK and DLLs. The connector was co-developed and is certified by SAP AG. And in most implementations, the SAP connector is used exclusively for outbound faxing from automated processes. The SAP Servers tab in the SAP Connector Configurator is where we define our SAP connections. The friendly name is the name of the SAP server and will appear in the SAP Connector trace. Note that friendly name in Faxination usually means that the field is arbitrary and only used as an administrative reference, but not in this case. The system address. Faxination user entities with this system address will be matched to this SAP server configuration for inbound messages and notifications. You may enable and disable this SAP server configuration without deleting it. Notifications for the SAP connector are unique and may be configured per message type. For instance, you may want notifications for outbound faxes, but not outbound SMS messages. This was implemented as an enhancement request and is expected to appear in other Faxination host connectors in future releases. On the Connections tab, you can define the client number that identifies this connector to SAP. 800 is the most common. You can specify the credentials to use for SAP server access and the language code of the SAP environment. 1- and 2-character language codes are supported, and the default is English. On the Client Settings tab, you can select the mode for SAP Communications. Dedicated server mode is the most common. Hostname is the name or address of the SAP application server host. This field may also include a SAP router string if required. And the target system number. This will be 0 in most environments. On the Server Settings tab, you can define the name of the SAP Gateway machine, the name of the SAP Gateway service. The SAP administrator can obtain this from the services file. And the program ID is a unique ID in the form of machinename.programname. On the Advanced tab, Use Unique Addresses is disabled by default. That means that SAP users that have the same fax or SMS number are treated as one user with only one set of options and permissions. When enabled, each user is managed independently, regardless of their fax or SMS address. This also means that you can identify messages from specific users in the Faxination log. Use proxy addresses means that we'll use the fax and SMS numbers already assigned to SAP users for inbound routing. Otherwise, inbound SAP routes will only exist when created manually in the Faxination Address Manager, which is the default. SAP Connector Tips. 95% of the Faxination SAP Connector implementation is performed by the SAP administrator within the SAP environment. Unless you're an SAP administrator, in most cases, you will not have direct access to the SAP system. And as we've already mentioned, nearly all Faxination SAP implementations are exclusively outbound faxing from automated workflows. Here's an example of a SAP router connection string, which can include the IP address or host name, a port number, and a password if required. The routes can also be chained.